With most of the NFL Week 3 action now in the books, I'm going to take the opportunity to take a step back here and talk through 10 of my biggest lessons learned and takeaways from this week's games. Of course, we'll be covering the most exciting details here and breaking down, the various changes that we've seen or developments of the NFL season up until this point in time as it relates to fantasy football. So if you're new around here, what are you doing? You need to drop down and smash that like button, click the subscribe button, and turn that bell on so you're never late for a new piece of content. We're posting multiple fantasy football episodes here on YouTube every single day of the week. So make sure to take advantage of that. We're starting our fantasy week 4 playlist here. And of course, we'll be diving straight into analysis for that with our waiver wire episode and our must add players here for this week. So go check all that great content out, and I'll see you guys in the video. My first takeaway here from week 3 action relates to Amari Cooper, a player that I loved early in this draft season, but faded late because, of course, the Deshaun Watson suspension and disciplinary action, which resulted in him not being available for our fantasy teams for the first 12 weeks of the year. Now, what I've learned about Amari Cooper here, observing the first 3 weeks of the season, is that he can absolutely crush it and still deliver premium fantasy point production in games where the Cleveland offense under Jacoby Brissett is facing a non-elite opposing defensive pass rush. In the first 3 games this season, Amari Cooper has been a bona fide stud in 2 of them. What I've observed from those contests is each of those games was against a non-elite level pass rush. Of the 3 teams that they've played this season, 2 of them rank in the bottom half of the National Football League in terms of opponent pass rush percentage, in terms of how much of the time was the quarterback on the other side, this being Jacoby Brissett here, pressured. The other was the Pittsburgh Steelers, who have somewhat of an outlier from TJ Watt, who was not on the football field this past week on Thursday Night Football, and obviously skewing those numbers from the, 2.5 quarters he played week 1 against Cincinnati. So all stuff that I was very, very tuned into here. The other part of this situation, of course, is that the Browns' offensive line is elite. So you have this elite offensive front 5 talent that's giving premier protection and comfortability to Jacoby Brissett in the pocket. When that's the case and he's not hurried, he'll get that football out on time and on target, and he'll be able to get Amari Cooper, who is a very good route runner on the perimeter, those very advantageous looks. So for Cleveland here, I'm feeling more and more opportunistic about Amari Cooper in terms of his availability to be a starting caliber player this week, not even necessarily this week, but just moving forward in those non-elite pass rushing fronts. He's faced, again, I said, a bottom 16 pass rush 2 out of 3 weeks, and then the Pittsburgh Steelers are ranked 15th right now. So 10 targets in week 2, 101 yards and a touchdown, that same stat line, but an 11th target in week 3 against the Pittsburgh Steelers. My second takeaway here is that Dameon Pierce has arrived for fantasy football. Absolutely crushed it. We said that the breakout week was coming here. It ended up coming true and coming to fruition. Our other breakout pick we'll talk about a little bit later also hit. Dameon Pierce, though, very solid player. I project him to be a solid running back 2 in situational matchups where you can project the Texans to have a somewhat decent game script. He ran the ball 20 times for 80 yards, 4 yards a clip, which is pretty average, but he's a physical runner. He runs the football hard and finishes every play. Did score a touchdown as well and caught 2 targets for 21 yards in the receiving game. So again, not necessarily someone that's going to crush it every single week. If the Texans are getting mopped off the floor, that's an issue for me. But Dameon Pierce in those games, think back to 2020 James Robinson, something along those lines of a workhorse and a poor offense. That's what Dameon Pierce can be for your lineups heading forward this season. The man, the myth, the legend, Justin Fields is a player involved in our third takeaway here, which is actually kind of a negative. And this just kind of topples on to last week. The Chicago Bears pass catchers in fantasy football are currently unsustainable. Justin Fields' passing attempts have been embarrassing the past couple of weeks here. He attempted 11 throws. He dropped back 11 times, one more time than 10. That is terrible. I mean, that for fantasy purposes here, they are shielding him and protecting him to an extreme that I probably haven't seen in this decade of football. So for Justin Fields, he has to throw the ball more if he's going to sustain fantasy football players. This sucks for Darnell Mooney, a guy who I liked coming into the season, but the target volume is not there. The targets that we thought he could be seeing in his high-end games this year are literally Justin Fields' totals for passing attempts. He threw just 17 passes here in week 3 against Houston. And again, that 11 pass performance came against a Packers team that beat them by 17 points. points. So the negative game script was there. The passing attempts were not. That's something we have to think about moving forward. Derrick Henry, the king here, moving into our next option for, or our next takeaway here for week 3 fantasy football as we move into week 4 here. Derrick Henry, my takeaway with him is that he can still be a running back 1, but he isn't nearly the same player he's been in years past. What we saw this week was the Tennessee Titans control the game script and have a very, very good start. They finished kind of slow and almost kind of got tied up and maybe go to OT against Las Vegas here, but when they were able to get off that quick start, Derrick Henry absolutely thrived. He is, more dependable than ever when the Tennessee Titans are facing a beatable opponent. But like we saw the first couple weeks of the season, even against the Giants, Henry had the ball 21 times on the ground and still managed just 80 yards. So the thing I do want to touch on here is that his current yards per carry this season has never went over 4.25, which is what he had this past week. His career average is 4.8 yards per carry. So the efficiency, whether it's the Derrick Henry thing, whether it's an offensive line thing, has dipped here. That is a problem. We want to see him getting those explosive runs. He was super involved in the passing game today. He did catch, 5 passes on 6 targets. So seeing some nice involvement and utility there, did add the rushing touchdown. But for me, I think a lot of this is going to come down to game script more often than we've seen in the past. We saw him take over a game against the Bills last year, who we thought of as a superior opponent. This season, I'm not so sure Derrick Henry can do those types of things, and that ultimately might hurt his ceiling and, of course, his fantasy finish as the year progresses. My 5th takeaway here is that Jalen Hurts, we were correct on this in the summer, is 1,000% in the quarterback 1 overall discussion. And to add on top of that, he may just be able to support 2 legitimate fantasy relevant players per week. Now, this week was awesome. He was able to produce A.J. Brown in a hellacious line from Devontae Smith here. We could even see him chip in a third with Dallas Goedert here, being a dependent pass-catching position, but even in those down weeks, I think he can squeeze out 2 here. The things we've seen from Devontae Smith the last 2 weeks have been absolutely absurd. For A.J. Brown this week, it was 5 receptions on 10 targets for 85 yards and a touchdown. That'll get the job done for where you drafted him at and, of course, the role he plays on your team. Devontae Smith won 8 receptions on 12 targets. A littler man playing a big man's game, going up and mossing players. His touchdown reception was elite. He had like a 40-some yard deep ball down the middle of the field that he nearly got in the end zone on a contested grab before that. That was a spectacular catch. Again, 8 receptions on 12 targets for a $169 and a touchdown. Jalen Hurts looks so much more poised as a passer this season. This offensive line is giving him the protection he needs, and his dynamic ability as a scrambler inside and out of the pocket is totally adding another dynamic to this offense here. So, like I said, Hurts, totally, 100%. He's right there with your Josh Allens of the world for being potentially the top quarterback in fantasy, maybe a Lamar Jackson as well, who's also balling out. But Jalen Hurts, if they sustain this rushing and receiving balance, he's right there. He's averaged 55 rushing yards per game so far this season and has had 3 rushing touchdowns at a clip, obviously averaging out to 1 rushing touchdown per game at 27.5 fantasy points per game. So elite stuff that we're seeing here. Our next takeaway, number 6, is that Chris Olave is becoming a lineup-worthy play. This is a player that I think has tremendous, you could argue he broke out this week. I think that last week was kind of the pre-breakout. We kind of all saw it coming with that enormous amount of air yards he saw. It was over 300 that he saw through the air. Jameis taking deep shot after deep shot after deep shot towards him. And even in a very underwhelming offensive performance, Chris Olave still got the job done for this team. Olave is a player that in the absence of Michael Thomas leaving the game with a foot injury and with Jarvis Landry's ankle causing him to get out of there, he was getting the football at a very high clip. He's had back-to-back 13 target games, 147 yards on 9 receptions this week. Again, that's premier territory. He still hasn't found that end zone on one of those big plays, but it's coming. Don't worry. Jameis is not going to stop airing the football out downfield to him, and he's easily the best deep threat this offense has. So I think there's a potential here for an easy top 24 play for him by the season's end if he continues to have this level of involvement in the offense. Now, I'm not saying he's going to have 13 targets every week, but even if he's able to, involve himself to 7 to 8, maybe even 9 looks on a great week alongside of Michael Thomas, I think he easily surpasses Jarvis Landry here. But all great things to see here moving forward. So feeling very good about Chris Olave and the role that he could play for our lineups here moving forward. Moving to the last final takeaways here, I want to talk through Garrett Wilson today. I think that Garrett Wilson, after week 3, has really established himself as the alpha wide receiver 1 in the Jets offense. offense. Now, the one screw, the curveball, the wrench you can throw on things here is the presence of Zach Wilson returning to this lineup. It's been 3 weeks of bliss and awesomeness here with Joe Flacco as of late. He's had back-to-back double-digit target games. He's had 10 targets on 6 receptions for 60 yards here in week 3 after leaving early with an injury. It's been looking good. 14 targets the week prior to that. His routes are phenomenal. His athleticism is phenomenal, and he is commanding the football to head his direction. Now, I do believe he surpassed Elijah Moore in this offense. Others of you may feel differently about that and may expect that Zach Wilson returns to the lineup here and maybe shifts that dynamic a little bit. But for me, it's Garrett Wilson. I think he is the man here. Of course, if he's healthy, he did sustain a rib injury, as I touched on briefly. So keep an eye on that. We'll, of course, be watching this very, very closely next week. But for now, and I'm not saying he's a must-start player by any means, maybe a little bit cautious with him next week with that transition period here, but I'm feeling very good about what I'm seeing. DeAndre Swift, my next takeaway here is that this ankle issue and just injuries in general, getting nicked for DeAndre Swift, could potentially be a bigger deal than I had initially anticipated. I thought that hearing him say from his own mouth that he was feeling a lot better after taking a rest day this past week, hearing that he was good to go, things are riding smooth here, his touches would go back up this week, and things would look a little bit more promising for him in the scoring department. But we've had back-to-back games of very disappointing touch totals, and not being as efficient or finding the end zone this week really reflected that in the fantasy scoring column. We saw Jamal Williams be the workhorse back for this team at 22 touches, a $107 in terms of scrimmage yards he collected here, and then 2 total touchdowns. So even though he's feeling better, he's not being utilized as the lead workhorse back that we know he is. He's the more talented player. He's the better pass catcher. Now, maybe he's not necessarily as big of a brute on the goal line, but he's very capable of being productive in that space. So only having 10 rushes for 46 yards in the week prior to this matchup. That was Jamal Williams a week ago. Now you've got DeAndre Swift here, who in week 2 had 87 total yards and a touchdown, again, being super efficient, and then not doing so here in week 3 is a little bit troubling. So I want to see him off the injury report. That's just something that now is going to be in the back of my mind a little bit as I set my lineups every week. It's going to be so dang hard to sit him in matchups, but it is obviously raising that bust potential. If he is dinged and nicked, that his usage could, plummet in big spots where you need him to produce. So just food for thought there with DeAndre Swift. Next up here, let's talk some Kyle Pitts. So my takeaway from this week's game is essentially Kyle Pitts owners, take a deep breath. This season is not going to be as clean or as pretty or as smooth as any of us anticipated. I think that Kyle Pitts looked really great coming off of last season, having 1,000 yards in his rookie year, just 1 receiving touchdown, but that all looked promising to get better here. It's not me doubting Marcus Mariota because we've seen him produce elite tight end numbers with Delaney Walker in the past. It's more so me worrying about the consistent usage of Pitts here. It's obvious Arthur Smith heard the chatter, the criticism this past week, and we hope to God that that involvement continues for him offensively here. But we don't know if that's going to be the case. This week, though, had his second 7+ target game, 8 targets on the day, 5 receptions, had 17.4 yards per catch. This is an elite football player. This is an elite NFL talent, a size and speed combo that's dang near impossible to block or guard. Block. We don't got a pass rusher here. Impossible to guard or defend is where I was going with that. Pitts needs to be in lineups. I don't want to see anything about sitting him unless you've got yourself a second very elite tight end option. I think you have to go that direction in most instances. Now, yes, Seattle didn't have a soul on that defense that could possibly line up across from Kyle Pitts and cover him man-on-man, but that's going to be the case for most teams here. Most guys don't have a Derwin James that are going to be able to just slap on him and tell him to go cover him for 4 quarters. So for me, Kyle Pitts is a sit-it-and-forget-it player. Yes, like I said, you're going to have those rough games, really brutal performances like we saw week 1 and 2, but that's just part of what we signed up for. Unknowingly, perhaps, but the case and inevitable reality here. And then finally, my last takeaway is that elite wide receivers can also be very disappointing. What do I mean by this? We're putting Justin Jefferson up on the screen. Don't mean to give him too much hate and blast him here, but did you know that Devontae Adams, Tyreek Hill, Jamar Chase, and Justin Jefferson, and actually, I should have added Cooper Kupp to this list as well. He did have a rushing touchdown, so produced some better points than expected, but between those 4 players that we all think of as top, 6 or 7 guys, some of those, your Chases and Jeffersons, your Adams, maybe top 4 guys, Tyreek's creeping into a lot of people's top 5 rest of season rankings. Really, the only guys that aren't on here are Stephon Diggs and a Cooper Kupp that I didn't toss into this analytic. But between those 4 players, again, Devontae Adams, Tyreek Hill, Jamar Chase, and Justin Jefferson. They had 112 combined receiving yards. That is just over 30 yards. Actually, it's not even 30 yards per player between those three. So they can bust too, just like fantasy running backs. They started off the season absolutely elite and on a tear. I'm not doubting we're going to have monster performances from them in the future, as soon as maybe even next week. But in games where I thought these guys had great matchups, they let me down. So something to be concerned about at times, and have that expectation heading into your lineup. They're not the 15 walking points that you expected them to be when you drafted them. So moral of the story, anyone can put up a stinker in fantasy football. It's just kind of the name of the game here, and something that we have to deal with on a weekly basis. So, and yes, I totally get it. Devontae Adams scored a touchdown. Jamar Chase, while fumbling a football, also scored a touchdown. He had 29 yards and 6 catches, which is horrid. But we can talk about that another time. The base, takeaway here is that sometimes you got to expect your best players to not live up to expectations. And with that comes not panicking. Don't freak out and go make an irrational move here and look to move on to greener pastures, because there really aren't any. These are the best of the best players and guys that I would 1,000% want on my fantasy team. So there you have it, my 10 lessons, my 10 takeaways from week 3 fantasy football. If you guys enjoyed, smash that like button, click the subscribe button, check out some of our other platforms in the description of today's episode, and I'll see you in a future episode. Peace out.